Here's another video, and this one's about the expanded Linnean Classification Scheme, and this comes out of your textbook. And in your textbook you can see this chart where the Linnean Classification Scheme is a scheme that's used to classify all life, all the way down to the species level. And unfortunately in your book they forgot the top one. There's one above kingdom, and it's called domain. So here's the complete Linnean classification scheme, and it begins with domain, goes down to kingdom, and those break down into phylum. Phylums break down into classes. Classes break down into orders. Orders break down into families. Families break it down into genuses, and that breaks down to the smallest unit for the Linnean scheme, which is species. So we got domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We've got three main domains of life, and they are domain Eukarya, domain Archaea, and domain Eubacteria. Okay, and domain Eukarya includes four kingdoms. So domain Eukarya breaks down into four kingdoms. Kingdom Animalia, which in English is animals. In Latin it's Animalia, but we use Latin for classifying organisms. Kingdom Plantae, which is the plants. Kingdom Fungi, which are the funguses. And Kingdom Protista, which are the single-celled organisms that belong to domain Eukarya. Okay. Now these two domains, domain Archaea and domain Eubacteria, are what we call prokaryotes. So domain Archaea are prokaryotes, and domain Eubacteria are prokaryotes. By the way, Eubacteria in English is bacteria. Eukarya, on the other hand, are eukaryotes. Now, what does that mean? Well, in biology, we have two kinds of cells. Now, you know that living things all are made up of cells. You're made up of cells. Your dog is made up of cells. A mushroom, any living thing is made of cells. But there's two main kinds of cells in the living world, or the biologic world. And there are prokaryote cells, and there are eukaryotic cells. What's the difference? Well, let's take a look here. Eukaryotes, which are your animals, plants, funguses, and protists, have cells that look like this. Prokaryotes, which are domain Eukarya, prokaryotes, which are domain Eubacteria and domain Archaea, have these kinds of cells. Let's take a look and see the difference. Eukaryotic cells, first of all, are bigger than prokaryotic cells and have a well-defined cell nucleus. So they have a nuclear membrane that separates the nucleus of the cell from the rest of the cell. They also have what we call suborganelles. What are suborganelles? Suborganelles. Okay, suborganelles are parts of the cell that are walled off from the rest of the cell and serve a specific function. This is a suborganelle. This is a suborganelle. We don't have time to go into all of the details because this is not a biology class, but you need to know the basics of cell structure if you're going to study living things, and that's what we're about to do. We're going to study life and how it's evolved over time. Animals, for example, have a suborganelle called a mitochondrion. Animals, including humans, elephants, fish, clams, they all have mitochondria. Now, what function does the mitochondria play in a animal cell? Well, let's take a look at what the mitochondria is. It's a suborganelle within a eukaryote cell, and it looks like this. Each one of your cells has one of these in it. And the job of the mitochondria is to convert the food you eat into energy. So, the mitochondria is sort of the power plant of the cell, and it provides energy for the organism. It converts food you eat into energy. All right? So, let's take a look here again. Our eukaryotic cell is a well-defined cell nucleus and suborganelles. And for animals, you're going to have mitochondria. For plants, you're going to have another type of suborganelle called a chloroplast. So plants don't have mitochondria in their cells. They have these things. And these things are green in color, giving plants their green color. And these chloroplasts in plant cells convert sunlight into energy. So plants, what they do is they do photosynthesis. And what they'll take in CO2 and water, and they'll manufacture their own food. So plants make their own food. They don't eat food. Plants make their own food by using sunlight and CO2 and making a type of food that they can eat. So plants have these chloroplasts in their for their suborganelle. The important thing we want in terms of evolution goes, we need to remember, is that all prokaryotes are asexual. They don't have gender. They don't reproduce through sexual reproduction. All sexual creatures are eukaryotes. Animals and plants, believe it or not, plants too are sexual creatures. There's male and female. You might ask yourself, how could a plant be sexual? Well, plants are sexual. Pollen is sperm. Fruits are ovaries. Seeds are embryos. So plants, yes, they are sexual organisms. They don't reproduce through internal fertilization like some mammals do, but they do reproduce by pollen and stamen. And when they come together, they will produce a fertilized seed, which is an embryo. Bottom line is, as I mentioned before, there are three domains you need to know about. Domain eukarya, and all organisms that have eukaryotic cells belong to domain eukarya. Then you have these other two prokaryotic domains, which is domain archaea and domain eubacteria, which is also, in English, we call them bacteria. In domain eukarya, we have four kingdoms: Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. Okay, so let's see how this works. We can look at humans. Humans belong to the species Homo sapiens, which belongs to a larger group of organisms that belong to genus Homo, which belong to a family called family Homidae, which belong to a larger group called the primates. Primates are monkeys, apes, and humans, which belong to a larger group called the mammals, or in Latin, Mammalia, which includes all warm-blooded organisms. Everything from rats to birds to mammals, which belong to a larger group called phylum Chordata. That's all organisms that have a backbone. That would include fish and amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs. And that belongs to a larger grouping called the animals. Animals are any organisms that eat, and of course they have mitochondria in their cells, which belongs to an even larger group, domain Eukarya. So the largest grouping of life is your domains, of which there are three: domain Archaea, domain Eubacteria, and domain Eukarya. Kingdoms are smaller, and there's a whole bunch of kingdoms in every domain. There's a whole bunch of phylums in every kingdom, and the very smallest is a species. So how are you going to remember this? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. From the largest grouping of life, the domain, to the smallest, the species. Well, I'll give you an easy way to remember it. I came up with a rhyme that might help you. Don't kings play chess on fragile glass stools? Don't kings play chess on fragile glass stools? I bet they do, yes. Domain, kingdom, phylum, order, genus, species. Right? That's a good way to remember it. So we could take a look, for example, at the coyote. The coyote belongs to the species, this is from your book, Canis latrans. Canis latrans. That's the species for the coyote. What genus do the coyotes belong to? Well, that's the first word always. So coyotes belong to genus Canis, and that includes a whole bunch of other creatures belong to Canis too, like Canis lupus, which is the wolf, or Canis domestica, which is the dog. They all belong to genus Canis. And coyotes also belong to a larger grouping called the family Canidae, which are all dog-like carnivores. That includes the foxes too, and many other things, dingoes and hyenas, which belong to a larger grouping called the carnivores. Order Carnivora. These are meat-eating organisms. Everything from sharks to whales to reptiles. Many reptiles also are carnivores. Hawks and eagles are carnivores. Anything that kills and eats. Then that belongs to a larger grouping called class Mammalia, which are all your warm-blooded organisms. And then that belongs to a larger grouping called Chordata, that have they have vertebrae. And that belongs to a larger grouping called Animalia. Those are creatures that eat. Animals and plants, which belong to kingdom Animalia and kingdom Plantae, are both eukaryotes. They belong to domain Eukarya. But the difference between the two is animals are what we call consumers, whereas plants are producers. Why? Because animals have to eat. Animals eat, and the mitochondria changes the food they eat into energy. and you need energy to survive. Plants, on the other hand, are producers because they produce their own food through photosynthesis. That's the big difference between the two. The other thing you want to note about when we're talking about evolution is when you're talking about eukaryotes, domain eukarya, animals, plants, funguses, and protists. Once again, we have a cell nucleus and we have these suborganelles. But specifically for animals, we have suborganelles called mitochondria, which allows us to change the food we eat into energy. And the important thing you want to remember about animals is that their DNA is stored in two places: in the nucleus of a cell. Every single cell in your body, there is DNA stored in the nucleus of your cell. That's what we call nuclear DNA. And there's another type of DNA called mitochondrial DNA that's stored in the mitochondria. These are stored in your 23 pairs of chromosomes for humans. And those chromosomes, in those chromosomes is recorded every single attribute you have. Your height, your weight, how big you can get, how athletic you're going to be, what color your eyes are, how big your toes are, your chances of getting diabetes or cancer or having a heart attack, how hairy you are, what the shape of your nose is. Everything is stored in that DNA, in your cell nucleus and in the mitochondria. But for when we're studying, have you heard of 23andMe and Ancestry.com and all those things? When you're tracing back your ancestors, and so that you back to your father and your mother and your grandparents and your great grandparents, and going way back, we can go way back further than that, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, by doing DNA studies. DNA studies are primarily done for humans through mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA studies primarily go only from a woman to her mother, to her mother, to her mother, to her mother. That's what we're best at when we're doing DNA studies, to study people's ancestors, going through the female line. But a new type of DNA study using Y chromosomes, which are stored in the nucleus of a cell, can also be used to trace a man back to his father, to his father, to his father, to his father, to his father. We'll look at that later on. But for now, just remember, the largest classification in life is the domain, followed by kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, finally down to species. And we're going to be talking about that over and over again. But for now, just remember the order, know how it works, know the main domains, know the kingdoms of domain eukarya. Know that eubacteria and archaea have prokaryotic cells and reproduce asexually, and that all sexual creatures, that means organisms that have male and female, have eukaryotic cells. So let's take a look for proof for evolution. There's so much proof, but I'll give you some basic proof that anybody with an open mind can see that evolution has to occur. Let's first take a look at homologous structures. Homo means what? It means the same. Ologous means what? It means structures. So homologous structures. If you take a look at the arm of a human, a horse, a cat, a bat, a bird, and a whale, they all have the same basic structure, which comes from the reptile originally. They've got this first part of the arm, where your bicep is, which is connected to your shoulder. Then you have a forearm, and then you have fingers. Some have more fingers, some have less fingers, like a horse only has one finger, which we call the hoof. If each of these were created separately and hadn't changed, why do they all have the same structure? They must have the same structure because they came from a common ancestor. That's the only logical conclusion. And homologous structures, or similar structures in organisms that evolved from a common ancestor, indicate evolution must occur. Analogous structures where organisms all develop similar structures, but they are not closely related, they're distantly related, such as birds and bats and flies, all developing wings, also is evidence for evolution, because Mother Nature only has a few designs that work to serve certain purposes, such as swimming in the ocean, fins tend to work, and flying, wings work. So each of these organisms needs to hunt by flying through the air, or they need to travel through the air to get from place to place to find their food if they're not a meat eater. Flies, bats, and birds all developed the same structure because they had to evolve that way in order to fill their niche in the biological world. It's more evidence for evolution. Probably one of the most convincing pieces of evidence for evolution is what we call vestigial structures. And you can see whales are still they still are born with pelvises and small. Why would they have a pelvis unless the only explanation is that their ancestors had to have walked on land, and we have found their ancestors, by the way. And then they slowly lose that pelvis or ankle bones or other things inside of whales because they no longer serve a purpose. They're a vestige of the past. Our appendix is a vestige of the past. When our diet consisted mostly of raw meat, we needed the appendix to process the meat we ate without getting sick. Well, now that once we learned how to cook, which happened about a couple 100,000 years ago, then the need for appendix disappeared, and now it's just a vestigial structure. Some people don't have an appendix. Or look at your dog. Do you ever look at your dog and notice that there's this thing called the Dewclaw? Okay, the Dewclaw is this extra structure here, which used to serve a purpose, but no longer serves a purpose. And you see this on your dog, right? This used to be part and parcel of the dog's pad, but now it's just a little thing that's all on its own. It's a vestige of the past. Or let's take a look at the human Cosex. The Cosex is right here on underneath, right here on your body, at the bottom of your pelvis. That's a tailbone, indicating that the ancestors, some of our ancestors must have had tails, and it's not far-fetched at all, ladies and gentlemen. Some humans are still born with tails. Some humans are still born with tails. It's a vestige from the past that still shows up sometimes. Usually what happens is the parents will have it cut off. Otherwise, this kid's going to grow up traumatized. Maybe he'll be in high school and wanting to go to the prom, and he could have a conversation with his dad. Dad, I asked all these girls out, and they wouldn't go with me to the prom. Do you think it might be this thing, Dad? This tail? No, son, it's not that. No. You got to improve your approach. I'm sorry, that's not funny. But there are all kinds of vestigial structures, remnants of the past. Let's take a look at some snakes, for example. Some snakes still have a little bit of a pelvis left behind. Why would they have a pelvis unless their ancestors didn't walk? Their ancestors must have walked. Why would they be created like this with a remnant of a pelvis in it? It doesn't make any sense. So vestigial structures, to me, are the strongest evidence that evolution must occur, because they're remnants of what those organisms were like in the past. So as we move onwards and forwards and study evolution, we're going to look at how many mammals, for example, come from a common ancestor. Who's the common ancestor? We can figure that out by looking at fossils. Horses, rhinoceros, and tapir are all odd. They have an odd number of toes. They're quadrupeds. They walk on four legs. They are plant eaters, and their DNA is very closely indicates they're closely related. That indicates, looking at this cladogram, that they came from a common ancestor. The evidence for evolution is really overwhelming. We look at the fossil record. We could principal superposition. We look at the older rocks and we go to the younger rocks. We see species change. We see them change into new species. It's well documented. We've caused evolution to occur by breeding horses, by breeding dogs to get the traits that we want. We produced the German Shepherd from some more ancient breeds who originally came from wolves. So evolution occurs, and we see it again and again and again in the rock record. And from what I can tell, evolution does not mean there's not a creator. It just means that species evolve, and those who have advantages pass those advantages on to the next generation. And over millions of years, those changes could be so large that new species come to be. And we see this in the rock record, and we'll talk about it more later.